Dear guests and distinguished panelists, good afternoon from Berlin to wherever you are. My name is Sandra Brecker. I'm member of the Board of Management of the Robert Bosch Stiftung, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to today's debate on COVID-19 and political systems. A year ago, we were in the first lockdown in Germany. From today's perspective, that lockdown was applied homogeneously and supported by a broad consensus among politicians and citizens. Now we find ourselves in a lockdown with different interpretations across the country. Next week, we expect to have clear guidelines which will be applied in all of Germany's federal states as a result of the widely discussed Corona emergency brake, which is officially the fourth act to protect the population, a legislation which just passed the German Bundestag yesterday. Maybe also an act of despair with the challenges of federalism. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we witnessed the growing importance of a body in German politics that otherwise receives little attention, the Minister-President's Conference. In this conference, the heads of Germany's federal states discuss measures to contain the pandemic together with the federal government. This process has led to considerable transparency and information sharing, sometimes in advance of meetings, and high public trust in decision-making at the beginning of the pandemic. By now, it symbolizes the cacophony of interests and is seen as one of the major reasons for the slow and often indecisive political action a year later. The German dream that everything can be managed with German efficiency took a considerable blow. Currently, we see a trend toward more centralized decision-making with binding benchmarks. Federalism, a cornerstone of German democracy, is being tested for crisis resilience. More than a year into the pandemic, we may have learned to deal with changes in how we live and work, but we are also questioning the legitimacy of restrictions to our freedoms, and we are thinking about the long-term effects on our political systems. Citizens are able to compare the performance of their respective government to that of other governments and political systems in what they perceive as a shared global experience, even though in different circumstances. Early into the pandemic, analysts were fast in casting judgment on whether democracies or autocracies fare better in times of pandemic. Now we seem to understand that the results are nuanced and the verdict remains open. More than the electoral systems, the degree of state capacity, preparedness, and above all, trust in government seem to have been decisive in COVID governance. Today, we know that in both democracies and autocracies, citizens must trust in the competency of their executive. The pandemic teaches us valuable lessons, and we are at the beginning of analyses to understand the consequences for our political systems and our societies. The Robert Bosch Academy, as an institution of the Robert Bosch Foundation, creates a space for such dialogue. Leading experts and decision makers come together to address topics of global importance and engage in solution-oriented cooperation. A longtime partner of the Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, promotes evidence-based and solution-oriented exchange on the challenges of our time. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this joint event that, in its unique assembly of speakers and guests, would have been less likely without the adaptations that the pandemic forced us to make. I look forward to the discussion. And it is a special honor for me to welcome our distinguished panelists today. Many thanks to Ambassador Chan Heng-chi, Ivan Krastev, and Professor Nair Woods for sharing their contributions with us. I would also like to say a special thanks to Tom Carruthers for hosting this event with us. I could not think of a more knowledgeable moderator and expert to guide us through the upcoming debate, and I'm very pleased to hand over to you now, Tom.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Well, it's great to be here. As Sandra said, we're trying to come to terms with the political effects of the pandemic. It's a tremendously complicated question. I think when the pandemic hit, we were, of course, first of all, buffeted by the public health damage to our societies. On top of that came all the changes to our lives, the way we work, the way we live. And then on top of that came the economic changes, the devastation to many economies, the upset. We knew that political effects would come as well, but we were less certain what they would be and when they would take place. And so that's our job here today, is to start to try to assess what are some of the political effects of the pandemic on systems, on institutions, on beliefs, on people. To do that, it's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists. We have Nairi Woods. Nairi is the founding dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. She's also a professor of global economic governance at Oxford. And I must say, she's not just the founding dean of the Blavatnik School, but the Blavatnik School is probably the most successful new policy school around the world of at least the last 10 years. And Nairi deserves a tremendous amount of credit for her leadership in establishing the school. And she's also known as a thinker and writer on issues of global governance and domestic governance as well. Then we have Ivan Krastev. Ivan is the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, Bulgaria. He's also a permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. And Ivan, I'm sure, is known to many of you as a deep, provocative, always original writer and thinker on issues of contemporary politics. Many books. His most recent book is called Is It Tomorrow Yet? Paradoxes of the Pandemic, which is just out last year. But I recommend that book and many others as well by Ivan. And then last, but definitely not least, we have Chan Heng-chi. Ambassador Chan is a distinguished diplomat with the Singaporean Foreign Ministry. She's currently ambassador at large. She previously served for 16 years as the ambassador of Singapore to the United States. She's also represented Singapore as the permanent representative to the United Nations. And in addition to her diplomatic accomplishments, she's a writer and thinker and speaker as well on many issues related to politics more generally. So we have three very different regional and I'd say intellectual perspectives on the issues before us. Here's how we're going to proceed. I'm going to direct some questions to each of the panelists and engage them in a conversation. First, I'm going to turn to each of them with, I have a question or two for each of them. Then I have kind of a broader question that I'd like to pull them all in, and we'll see how that goes, a couple more questions. And then I'm going to begin to look for comments from you in the audience and bring in your comments and questions as well as we go along. So without further ado, let me turn first to Nairi. Nairi, the United Kingdom has had what has to be described as a roller coaster ride with the pandemic. It seemed like last year there just was one piece of bad news after another for Boris Johnson and his team. And Great Britain was struggling hard to deal with the pandemic in governance terms. This year, the news has been good. The vaccine rollout in the United Kingdom has been remarkably successful. Case rates are way down, and it seems that Britain may be turning a corner. If you look back on this period of the last 12 to 15 months, how would you describe the political effects or the political kind of ramifications of the pandemic in British life? We're starting with a one country focus, then I want to go out and we'll look a little bit more broadly. But if you could start with a British perspective, I think that would be a good place to start.
Right. So I think you're right, Tom, that the high point of the roller coaster was the work of the vaccine task force and the rolling out of the vaccine. And that's an example of a government collaboration with others that really worked brilliantly. Government stayed firmly in the driving seat with its legitimacy, its connection to people, trusted by people, and brilliant private sector folk, people like Kate Bingham, June Rain, etc., were brought in to bring their expertise into government and to really make that program work. That's a really great model. And if future pandemics all have vaccines, that was a good investment for Britain. Obviously, future pandemics won't all have vaccines. And that's why the bottom of the roller coaster is important for us to focus on as well, which is the failure on the test and trace system, where instead of putting government in the driving seat, the government simply said, we can't do this, and brought in management consultants, brought in and outsourced the whole contract. The problem with that, and if Britain had focused more on what was working in Asia across different economies, from Vietnam to Sri Lanka to China, they would have quickly discovered that the essence of test and trace is local. What's very sad in Britain is that Britain had already in place hundreds of environmental test and traces located in local government that do things like follow up on restaurant food poisoning cases. They were completely ignored by London, which overrode them, spent 35 billion on a test and trace system entirely outsourced, which nobody had any faith or trust in. And so test and trace is still not working. I can tell you, sitting in the Blavatnik School of Government, when one of our students, gets a test, they don't get a notification through test and trace for days afterwards, which is hopeless. The Lancet ran an article showing that local government, which has had no resources for doing this, is 8 times more effective using the rather hard-stretched local environmental tracing officers. So for me, those 2 lessons are pretty important moving forward, but just 2 big shifts that are occurring in British politics as a result. The very first is the Union itself. The United Kingdom comprises England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and never have those 4 nations been more separate. Each has taken their own approach to COVID, and this is coming on top of Brexit, which has put each of them in a very different position. So actually one of the biggest challenges to the United Kingdom going forward is whether it remains the United Kingdom or not, and with what enormous strains in that political union. The second is economic. The big losers from COVID, disproportionately unemployed, are women and young people who were in the casual sector. Britain has, like the United States, a very large number of 0 or variable hours contract workers, people in fairly insecure jobs who immediately lost their jobs. Some of it's hidden because of the government's furlough payments. But that's going to mean that Britain, which went into COVID with very, very high inequality that was both regional, and generational, is going to come out of COVID with an even deeper problem. And for politics, that means that politicians' eyes are very focused on what they like to call the blue wall or the red wall, working class voters that switched from Labour to the Conservatives, which are the focus and preoccupation of the current Conservative government, is holding on to those workers. Finally, what Britain is going to need moving forward, and actually what all democracies are going to need, is quite a long-term strategy for building back infrastructure, for building back a social fabric of Britain, and for competing with the very long-term governments that are in other parts of the world. And that's quite a problem for governments who are changing ministers ever more quickly, who want to reduce the size of the civil service, which is the one permanent strand in the pack, and who are creating a politics which is more and more about daily announceables and less about a long-term strategy for the country.
It sounds like from what you say, Nairi, that, prior to the pandemic, inequality and the general sense of kind of resilience of the societies in which many democracies, exist, were already in question. And so is it that perhaps politically that the pandemic has sort of intensified our focus on these kind of core issues of whether democracies are producing for people, whether they're delivering social justice, whether they're delivering economic goods and economic justice? Do you see the pandemic, therefore, as a kind of intensification of the political condition that we were already in? Or do you see it as somehow kind of a turn in a different direction? I guess that's sort of my question. Is it really more of the same, more intensely, or are we somehow turning in a different direction? I know it's a bit of a philosophical or abstract question, but I wonder if you could ponder that.
I think there's 2 different answers depending on where you sit. For the population, it's a bit of a roller coaster, up and down in terms of their support for government, and so it's not clear exactly where they'll land up. I think when you're looking closely at government, what is specific to COVID is that the government lacks connective tissue to cities, to local regions, and to other nations within the Union. And what that means is there are no mechanisms in Britain for sharing data, for sharing decisions, and for sharing resources to solve this kind of crisis. In other words, Britain is well equipped to deal with a financial crisis where you can make all the decisions in London and simply, almost at the stroke of a pen. And this crisis has shown that there are some serious weaknesses in the capability of the political machine to join up locally. And it's something that Sandra mentioned in her comments at the beginning about Germany's efforts to do this and the ups and downs of those efforts. I think in Britain, it's about restoring trust between local government and central government, and then literally creating mechanisms for them to share decision-making and share resources to execute.
Interesting. Well, it's certainly, in the United States, an issue screaming at us, which is this level of trust. We're trying to get more than 50 to 60% of the population vaccinated, and we have 30 to 40% that indicate they do not want a vaccine because of their lack of trust. And so it isn't a detail, this trust issue. It is core to whether or not we can get through this pandemic. Thanks very much. Let me, go ahead.
On that, Tom, what's been really interesting in Britain is the trust in the vaccine process, where part of the success on vaccines has been the willingness of the ministers in that domain to really send funding out to local communities. They're using mosques, they're using churches, they're using trusted community centers to deliver those vaccines. And that's the very best kind of government connectivity. And as I said, the complete opposite to the test and trace system, which is using an anonymous website and a huge outsourced company, which nobody trusts.
Well, the trust issue actually connects directly to the next question I wanted to pose, which is to Ivan Krastev. Ivan, you were ahead of the curve many years ago in giving attention to the rise of populism in Europe, to its importance, both as a set of movements and also the effects on institutions that it would have. As you look at this phenomenon of political populism what are some of the effects that you see? I must admit, when the pandemic first hit, part of me thought, well, this actually may really hurt the populace. Citizens will want a scientifically based, rational, competent governance kind of response to the pandemic. So this has got to be bad news for populists. But then another part of me thought, well, wait a minute, this is the kind of event that will citizens' faith in governance, damage their faith in elites and institutions, and it may be boon day for the populace. Here we are 12 to 15 months into the pandemic. What do you think the balance sheet is for populists in Europe, either those who are close to power or those who are farther from power?
Thank you, Tom. I have the same two parts in me. If you're going to see the results, first of all, we are very early on. One of the interesting stories that you get when you talk to people that suffered a much more severe form of the COVID was that basically they said the worst is that the days in which you have the feeling that you're doing better and you're improving, and then suddenly, basically you can carry very much worse. I'm saying this because for this 1 year, it was interesting to see how much the very idea of who is winning and who is losing has been changing. In the first 3 or 4 months, people were saying why, for example, East Europeans are doing so well. Now the question is why they're doing so badly. The same basically Europe versus the United States and some other things. I'm saying this because probably we're going to need slightly more time, and also when some of the economic and other issues come to the surface, to know what is going to be the long-term effect. But I do believe that there's several things which we can try to put on the balance list now. I don't believe that the Populist Party in this 1 year basically succeeded to gain support as a result of the COVID-19. And I'm talking only Europe, because this is what I know better. And the reasons, in my view, at least 4. One of the important things that happened with the COVID is that suddenly we started to live in a common world. The moment in which we have been kind of locked in our apartments was the moment in which basically we understand that we're living in a common world. And as a result of it, one of the major changes in the way politics functioned was that we all start to live in a very specific dictatorship, and this was the dictatorship of comparisons. I was seeing this very much, basically, ordinary Bulgarians who basically never have been interested much of what is happening outside of the country, then suddenly start to be interested of how many people are infected in Brazil or how many people are dying in Belgium. I'm saying this because this created a situation in which democracies on one level functioned very much without a clear opposition parties, at least in the beginning, but at the same time we had the idea that we very easily can compare who is doing well and who is doing badly. And this changed. The Populist Party didn't, from this point of view, I mean, particularly Populist Party in opposition, didn't manage to gain much of it. Second, European populism was so much focused on the problem of migration in the previous period. That one of the interesting effects, of course, of COVID-19 was that in this very short period, migration disappeared as an issue. I do believe it's going to come back, and this is why we're going to see how it's going to work. But suddenly, basically, people are not coming to Europe. People are not moving from one side of the street to the other. And this basically made all of these political leaders who made their popularity in places like Italy or Hungary and Poland very much fighting against migration, they lost the issue. But where I do believe we're going to see a major change, and this change can affect negatively democratic politics, is exactly what you were talking about. The idea of trust. And like you in the beginning, I had the feeling that because it's about public health, people are much more ready to trust doctors than, for example, economists, compared to the global financial crisis. And in the beginning, you have the feeling that something like this was there. But then 3 important things happened. For many ordinary citizens, the very nature of science, the fact that scientists disagree with each other, which I do believe is what science is about, became the reason not to trust anybody. It is amazing to see some of the data that I see from Europe on the level of trust in conspiracy theories. I do believe that the infection of conspiracy thinking could be one of the long-term effects on the political systems. People are really ready to trust anything. And this is changing very much the way the countries are becoming governable. The second thing that is also changing very much is that if you're a national political leader in Europe these days, and you try to basically show to your people that you're doing the best that you can, now one of the ways to try to break European rules in order to show that you're ready to do anything. So Mr. Orban basically was getting the Russian and the Chinese vaccines, not because he was convinced that this is going to work better, but because for him, I'm doing what others are not doing, was the way to try to show what he's doing. And thirdly, and for me, this is very important, many people really became very suspicious that the governments are not simply imposing these restrictions because this is needed, but because governments like the state of emergencies. Mm-hmm. Of course, this is very strong among the younger generation, and I do believe this is making the trust in governments even more problematic in a moment in which delivering is not easy. But just answering in one sentence your question, populist parties for the moment, at least in Europe, neither in government nor in opposition, are benefiting from the crisis because the populist governments in Poland and Hungary, for example, did badly. They didn't do well. On the other side, the populist parties, even Salvini in Italy and so was losing votes. But on the long term, the level of mistrust which came as the outcome of the crisis for the moment is going to inject much more kind of a populism in the system and not simply in a certain type of political actors.
Interesting. Let's bring in an Asian perspective. Thank you, Ivan. Let's bring in an Asian perspective. Ambassador Chan, of course, across Asia, whether it's East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, there have been just a tremendously diverse range of experiences that Asians have had with the pandemic and with their governments. It's actually impossible to generalize if you go all the way from India to even just India to China comparison is already remarkable in its diversity. But could you nevertheless extract for us, what do you think some of the Asian citizens are taking away from the pandemic experience, either in their own country or watching the diversity of experiences within Asia? And then we'll come to a comparison between Asia and the West in a minute. But if we just focus for a minute on what do you think some of the Asian perspectives have been of the experience of the pandemic?
Thank you, Tom. You know, when you talk of the pandemic, we started last year and now we are more than a year, and it's been sort of changing and evolving. But generally, I would say this pandemic has been an eye-opener for many of the countries in Asia. That's because of what we saw initially, the reaction of Britain, Europe, and the United States, and how it handled the pandemic. Remember that the United States and Britain and many countries in Europe were sort of models, aspirations of how our societies, we wanted to be as developed, as rich and as scientific, as modern in a way as these countries. And then suddenly you saw the way the countries were, especially the United States in the Trump administration, was just floundering and acting in a really unbelievable way. This was this country where scientific revolutions, scientific discoveries were sort of happening all the time, and we look to the United States, and you became anti-science, for instance. And so I think that was a bit of a shock, Now, I think I would like to hastily add that since President Biden has come in and the way he rolled out the vaccines, I think in Asia, we sort of say, okay, is this the old America? The competency has come back, because what the pandemic has shown up, and if you look at Asian countries that have done well, and these are China, Hong Kong, territory, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, we've had, if you look, all of us had decisive governments and we had competent governments. But I would want to add that this is not just Asians, because if you look at Australia, there was decisive and competent government. And if you look at New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern acted very decisively and competently. So it's not East-West, but in Asia, we seem to have more countries that react that way. But there are Western countries in Asia which also could act in this decisive and competent way. And perhaps countries in East Asia, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, had the advantage of, if you can call it advantage, of going through a SARS period. And we learned to be resilient in dealing with the pandemic. Korea had a MERS outbreak in 2015. So we've learned. But decisive government is important. Competent government is important. Trust is very important. Everybody talked about that. And I think this is where we are sort of different, from many Western governments. Trust, if you look at the Edelman Trust measures, which comes out annually, amazingly, in India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, you just name all the Asian countries, trust for government is high, and post-pandemic, even higher, So that's quite interesting. And in Singapore, I asked a 30-something-year-old IT person who came to fix my computer. I said, aren't you concerned with the pandemic? She goes out. She said, no, because it only attacks old people. I said, I'm so sorry. It's not just old people. But she said, but never mind. If I get sick, our health system will look after us. So there was great trust. And in Singapore, there is trust. I think in most of the Asian countries, there is trust. So they track, they trace, they wear masks because they have been asked to. And I would say that I put this to a communitarian culture that Asian countries seem to have. I leave India out at the moment, but if you look at East Asian countries, we have a communitarian culture. And a communitarian culture puts emphasis on community. You work for the good of the community, you look after each other. But I also don't think this is just an Asian trait. I see Scandinavian countries as communitarian, small democracies. And New Zealand, in a way, is communitarian, maybe because it is a small democracy. And maybe the Maori culture is that way. So we look after each other, and it's the good of the community. In Western liberal culture, I think there is an emphasis on individual liberty and freedoms. And this is great for innovation, creativity, not so good for tackling crisis. And I understand there is a kind of libertarian streak in liberal societies where after a while, young people or just people say, why can't I go out? And if I want to get COVID, I'll get COVID. Who are you to say I shouldn't go out? I think that streak, the libertarian streak, sometimes comes out. I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just different societies, And I don't want to fall into the trap of saying only Asian societies are this way, Western societies are, because I see communitarianism in some Western societies. I see decisiveness, ability to act in Australia and New Zealand. But has the reputation of Western governments taken a hit? Yes, to some extent. And I think for us in Asia, what has been more damaging to watch is not just how you handle the pandemic, is that it's become ideological. It's got caught up with the US-China tensions. So the pandemic becomes just another platform to carry out the US-China struggle. Whereas when I look at SARS in the past, globally as a community, WHO and so on, we came together and tried to find some solution. There was an absence of multilateral attention, and there was not even sympathy in a sense. I mean, if you look, how many have actually helped in providing vaccines to others? There's vaccine nationalism. Everyone is trying to corner vaccines for themselves. So multilateralism has taken a hit, and I really think it's become ideological, this whole treatment of the pandemic, and it's been caught in the US-China rivalry, and that's made the pandemic more complicated.
Wow. Listening to the three of you, we were 2 or 3 years ago before the pandemic in terms of thinking about the evolution of global politics. And at the time, I used to say, there are several big trends. One of them was that I felt that we were moving into a very post-ideological world in which citizens wanted, above all else, a certain amount of competence from governments. That they really didn't care very much about the ideological character of the regime. What they wanted was a government that was somewhat effective and that, above all, solved problems of injustice and exclusion and so forth. Yet a second trend that was in friction with this was this, just what Yvonne's referring to, was tremendous skepticism about authority and about institutions. Citizens were just very uncertain about who they could trust and whether or not the institutions they had could serve them. And then a third trend was this larger shift in the world of relative power from the West to Asia. Those of us in the West knew in the last 20 years that the 21st century was becoming more and more of an Asian century, and not that it exclusively Asian, but certainly the relative weight of Asia in economic and social and political affairs was just becoming evident. So it somehow seems that the pandemic has brought into sharp relief these trends. It sort of highlighted that what we really want from governments and what we need from them so badly. Secondly, that we really have a serious problem, at least in some of the governments, with skepticism about institutions. And then third, the pandemic has really elevated Asia relative to the West. The world has watched for a year and a quarter as the West has stumbled again and again. And Asia, on the whole, not India, but the rest of Asia, or much done relatively well. So maybe it's just that the pandemic hasn't created anything new so much as sort of intensified these trends. Is that, I want to just touch back with Nairi and Yvonne and just check with you. Are there other, when you try to sort of get your arms around this topic and think, how is this really changing politics? Is it something new, or is it reinforcing things that were already emerging? Nairi, back to you just for any comments on what you've heard so far.
So I think I agree with you, Tom, about the longer term trends. I think there's two perhaps that I would add to your list. And one is that the lockdowns that countries have done have hugely accelerated not just digitization, but the digital divide and what digital divide means for communities, where half are having intensive one-to-one schooling and the rest have no access to any education at all. So I think that's a further one. And then the other one I would add is that particularly, we've discussed vaccines and vaccine confidence. The rise, the acceleration of fake news and its capacity to actually bring about life or death waves of popular trust or distrust. And at the same time, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a very few who are in control of the tech companies upon which everybody's relying, whether it's Amazon or streaming services and such like. Some 400 Americans are now holding more than, I think it's 17 or 18% of GDP. And I think that's a huge challenge of regulation, both of monopoly rents in the tech sector and of regulation around the kind of fake news agenda. Obviously, Singapore has a whole story to tell on that. But I would add those two to the mix and say that those two accelerate the trends that you were talking about, where precisely because people don't trust their governments, they're defaulting back to identities, to visible identities, which are racial, which are religious, which are small communal identities, and they're more and more vulnerable to narratives about who makes them secure and who they should distrust. And that makes for a very, very much more volatile politics.
Indeed. Wow. I'm really glad you point that out. It connects directly to work I've been doing in the last few years. I've gotten kind of obsessed with the topic of political polarization. I did a book on looking at polarization in 9 different countries. The wave of polarization that we see, whether it's Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, Kenya, Turkey, the United States, Brazil, etc., is linked very much, Nairi, to what you say about identities. It's that when politics, as one political scientist put it, when political competition becomes a battle of social identities, you have a problem on your hands, because politics, once it's a battle of social identities, becomes a blood sport, not a question of, quote, normal politics. And if the pandemic has highlighted or intensified this, as you say, kind of search for identity and the desire to hold on to what identity you have, then that's probably going to also magnify this trend as well. So it seems like a further connection to previous trends that we're defining in our era. Yvonne, how does this strike you?
Listen, I very much agree with you that it's not that the train changed direction. Simply, we have been on a slow train and we have been put in a very fast train with some of the trends that we're seeing. But when you say about competence, and this is the interesting story, for me, the first question is, to what extent the pandemic is creating new identity and new dividing lines, and to what extent it's really escalating already existing divisions? And probably it's too early, but United States is a great example. Poland is a great example to show that in a certain way, you don't have a new dividing lines. Simply the polarization in a certain way escalated and it started to speak the language of the pandemic. Whom you trust, whom you don't trust. For example, even people who normally are going to say that they trust science, they're going to say we don't trust scientists because we believe that it's not that they are informing the government decisions, but the government is simply justifying their decisions with the scientists that they need. And this is, in my view, this is extremely important. And the other thing that struck me is that we talk very much about the impact of the different political systems, democracies versus authoritarianism and others. But if I'm going to ask you, basically, just telling you what kind of a policy certain governments have adopted in this 1 year, and trying to guess, is it a democratic or a non-democratic government, it's not going to be inside. And also all this, for example, internationalist rhetoric that was coming from the European Union and so on, it will materialize. Paradoxically, you're going to see that democracies that normally was talking and perceived as being much more nationalist, including Germany and others, were the ones that basically didn't give kind of a vaccines to anybody. In the case, for example, of the Western Balkans, it was ridiculous to see that when it comes to the vaccination of 4,000 or 5,000 medical workers in Northern Macedonia, the vaccines came from Mr. Vučić in Serbia and from none of the EU member states. So from this point, there is something strange also happened, is that the way that different societies and political systems were viewing themselves turned to be wrong. In a certain way, the idea that you have a kind of a much more internationalist-minded governments which really care about everybody, and suddenly in the moment of the crisis, you cannot make a major distinctions between, for example, how Hungary was basically functioning or how Germany was functioning. This is an interesting issue, and as a result of it, I do believe one of the things is happening is that we now cannot naively pretend that we are what basically we claim to be. And paradoxically, we have an identity politics, but also certain identities that we have created for ourselves have been very much questioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Ambassador Chan, I want to bring in China a bit into the discussion. And I wonder from your perspective in Singapore, you know, in the news in the United States, there's a kind of standard discussion now of China's role in the pandemic. It's that China has been trying to tout its success at home in getting the pandemic under control, trying to win points on the international stage through vaccine diplomacy, trying to get other countries to sort of to owe it something, exerting itself in South America on the issue of Taiwan, and sort of for countries to get the vaccine, they have to trade the recognition of Taiwan. The case of Paraguay has come up recently. And so the picture in the Western press is that China's kind of tried to take advantage of the pandemic for its own diplomatic reasons, but that it's falling short on that because it's seen as selfish. But I wonder, at least that's in some accounts, I wonder from your perspective, do you think China has been effectively trying to play its pandemic card, or do you think that China has actually into the mistake of assuming that it could project a positive view of China abroad in this? What do you think the overall image has been?
I think different countries in Asia have a slightly different nuanced view of China. Many of the countries in my region, in ASEAN, are using Chinese vaccines, and they can acquire Chinese vaccines. It's also much cheaper. So, they don't see China, in the way that the Western press seems to portray China. Let me say this. China is not an angel. It does make mistakes. But I think there has been it's been demonized in many ways, and may not be fully deserved. For instance, the origins of the virus. Yes, China was a bit slow in giving out the information and should have given the information. But even if the information had gone to the United States or to Europe, would you have acted if it went 1 month earlier? I think initially the reaction was, it's an Asian virus. So I think that you're 1 month late in getting the news, but would you have acted if it was given to you 1 month earlier? And let's be honest, we all don't know very much about the virus. When we first discovered the virus, we got smarter and smarter in learning more about the virus. And the virus is so wily, it still, eludes us. Now there are so many variants. So what can we say about the virus? So I always thought that it would have been much better if we didn't go down that road and just started collaborating to see how the world community can deal with the virus. China has come up with some successes, but I think it's also been very, shall we say, calculating about the way it uses vaccines and offers assistance. And there's been some blowback, against China for that. And I think they realize it, but I don't see much change in the behavior. It seems not to filter through as much. And I think they have not enjoyed as much success as they thought they would with their vaccine diplomacy, because it seems to have this quality of wanting people to be grateful in their conditions and so on. So I would say that they've made some mistakes there, but don't seem to realize that.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to go up to the level of global governance. I'm going to build upon something Yvonne said, and I want to turn to Nairi, who's a student of global governance. I like the way you highlighted, Yvonne, this idea that the vaccine stripped away the illusions we try to project out into the world about our countries as benevolent actors who are very cooperative. When the vaccine hit, it was every country for itself. I mean, it was naked. I mean, countries were just, I'm going to keep what I have, and whether it's a mask or protective equipment or a potential vaccine, it was not a pretty sight internationally, even just within the European Union, let alone, the wider world. So I think, the first 6 to 12 months of the virus were a global governance nightmare, frankly, and the WHO almost in collapse and other things. But now in the last 6 months, is there some sense that we've moved out of that and we're starting to inch towards potential cooperation? So I guess my question, Nairi, is could we come out of this with some sense of renewed realization, urgency, capacity to act in transnational ways? Could we say, well, how do we prepare for the next pandemic? Or have we learned some things about how countries should have worked together better? Or is it just that our illusions are stripped away and we have to live with the realities of what they were? So is there any sense of building back better at a global governance level as well as domestically?
So I don't think it's a universal truth that countries will all act atavistically any more than it is true of individuals. Mm-hmm. What we do know from social science is that what shapes individual behavior is what people believe other people will do. Even very honest people act in less honest ways when they believe that everybody else is acting dishonestly. And similarly, dishonest people act more honestly when they believe that everybody else is going to act honestly. And similarly, among countries, the way countries act depends to a large degree on how they think others will act. And that is why leadership in the international system is so important, because it can actually shape whether countries believe that the solution will be cooperative or not. So coming into COVID, we were, of course, in a parlous state in global governance because we had a system since the Second World War, but much accelerated since the end of the Cold War in 1990, which was all hinged on American leadership. So when you had, after a period of some slow withdrawal from that leadership role, when you had President Trump hugely accelerate it and just do a kind of smash and grab on global cooperation, you created a huge void, which neither President Xi Jinping nor Chancellor Merkel could step into in a way. So I think what that first phase of COVID showed us is how important a global signal or a message is. Think back to 2008, November 2008, when President George W. Bush called the G20 to Washington in the face of a massive global economic crisis and succeeded in getting those 20 leaders to agree that they would signal to the world an intent to grow out of it. That was huge because it averted what could have been a more catastrophic crisis. We saw none of that leadership as this pandemic hit. Instead, we saw, therefore, in the absence of leadership, this kind of atavistic behavior. Now, how do we rebuild back from that? I would want to signal first that even in the absence of that leadership, a lot of cooperation continued. The World Health Organization has come in for a beating from everybody, but actually, for a small organization with less of a budget than a large American hospital, for an organization that has no enforcement powers at all and only has the power of persuasion, for it to have managed to get China and other countries to share information, to share sequencing, to share medical information, to share research with it at speed and to share that with each other is important. The cooperation between China's CDC and America's CDC right from early January, really important. The unprecedented cooperation among global pharmaceutical companies and researchers has been pretty unprecedented. So I think we mustn't just look at where cooperation's failed. We have to look at where it succeeded. The fact that the G20 have agreed to a small first step on debt suspension for the poorest countries. Is it adequate? No way. It's nowhere near adequate. But does it show that the United States and China, even at the height of antagonism, can agree on a small step together on debt suspension? Yes, it does show us that. So coming out of the crisis, what I think we'll see is we'll see an ongoing importance of the G20 as a crisis committee. And if the G20 works well, it will orchestrate what we expect international organizations to do. I think there's a sober understanding that you need a health organization to share information in a crisis. And there's some quite strong and collaborative thinking about the other arrangements we need for future pandemics. So I actually come out of this relatively positive. I think this plus the massive acceleration in concerns about climate and climate change, which is leading people for the first time seriously to speak about whether you give the World Trade Organization enough muscle to actually start proposing things to member states so you can actually move ahead and move an agenda ahead that's been paralyzed for 30 years. I'm starting to see some green shoots, but as you know, Tom, I am eternal optimists.
I know. I'm feeling so much better having called on you for this question. I mean, if you don't mind a follow up, is that because you mentioned climate change? In the early months of the pandemic, I thought to myself, in a way, the pandemic is like a drastically speeded up version of climate change. We have the first month of denial, we have the second month of hesitant adaptation, we have the third month of finally getting serious. We finally get serious when so much damage was done, and if only we had gotten serious before. It had many of the characteristics of what it looked like to me the story of climate change is, just on a like a drastically speeded up film. I'm wondering whether the experience of the pandemic has somehow, because of this metaphorical connection between the pandemic and climate change, has somehow speeded up our realization of the significance of climate change and our need to act now. Is there some sort of crossover or read across, as the British would say, from the pandemic to climate change? Because in the United States, partly it's just the election of President Biden. So we finally have a US government that actually recognizes that climate change is real, stops denying, starts getting serious. But we might be in a moment of actually quickly catching up a bit. Now, there's so much more that needs to be done, but there's a sense of quick catching up. And I can't help but attribute some of that to the experience of the pandemic. Is this a far-fetched idea on my part, do you think, Nairi, or do you see any relationship between these two things?
No, I think they are both, exogenous shocks. They're both things that that affect every country in the world and pose massive collective action problems. Mm-hmm. You simply cannot, in the face of a pandemic or climate change, say we will deal with this on our own, because you can't deal with it on your own. You actually have to cooperate with others. And at the national level, that you actually, for climate and pandemic containment, it means citizens have to rely on government. Mm-hmm. And so I think what COVID has shone a spotlight on is the weaknesses of government, the weaknesses of leadership, the weaknesses, as I was saying earlier, of connective tissue to communities, the weakness of government's capacity to partner with the private sector and to set clear guidelines for the private sector. And it needs to do both. It needs to do both for climate change, and now fighting the pandemic has been the closest to fighting a war that to fighting a world war like World War II than most countries have had, in the sense that governments have had to spend so much money fighting the pandemic, and at the end of it, they're going to have to spend so much more building back after it. Mm-hmm. And it's in that sense that this is a very special situation. And I think so I think your parallel with between climate and the pandemic is right, and it both coming together have highlighted those challenges, particularly for democracies.
It's interesting. I don't know if Yvonne or Ambassador Chan, that conversation sparks any thoughts, or otherwise I have one or two more questions. And I invite those of you watching to send in comments through the comments section. But Ambassador Chan, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, I was going to say that actually I think because of the pandemic, there's greater awareness and link with climate change. Mm-hmm. In the past, if you said, if the climate can affect your well-being, and your survival, people didn't take that for real. Now the connection is made very clearly. But I fear that in my part of the world, in poorer countries, in the developing world, although there's an awareness, and there's even an awareness now that there will be a next big pandemic, disease X is going to come. Even as we say this, not many countries will really act, because they are looking for assistance, financial assistance, for them to take the right steps to do the right things for climate change. And it comes with the need for resources. So some countries will take action. People are aware, but we did a recent survey in Indonesia, when I did a study, and people weren't the man in the street. They were not very aware about the dangers of climate change.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, no, understood. Yvonne? Yeah.
Yeah. I also want to make a point, because I very much agree with Nairi and you that there was a very important connection between the pandemic and climate. But maybe slightly less optimistic than it can look. Because paradoxically, if 3 years ago we're going to have this conversation and you're going to ask the question, what kind of crisis can push for international cooperation? And out of all crises, pandemics look the easiest one.
Yeah.
Affect everybody at the same time. Very much the public health of everybody depends on how others are going to do. And suddenly in this kind of a shock test, we didn't do well. And we didn't do well also because our publics on one level discovered how interconnected and how interdependent we are, but people start fear interdependence. If you see the rhetoric of the government, it is not that we should basically better manage the world. The problem is how to decouple here, how to decouple there. In a certain way, there was a very strong anti-globalization sentiment that was triggered by this crisis. And what I fear is that at the same time, of course, climate and basically cooperation about climate is the discourse which keeps states and politicians the way to show that they have certain interest in cooperation. But at the same time, the level of geopolitical polarization, of course, particularly United States, China, is very strong. And these two things are not going to go easy together. And it's not only China, basically what the Russians are doing recently. This is not the things that you can imagine that you can cooperate about climate change and fight about everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe slightly that the idea that we can basically come with a very cooperative agenda between states and at the same time going into a kind of a cyber wars, declared or undeclared, basically moving troops here and there, and very much speaking the language of power and a classical geopolitics, it sounds good as an article. I don't know how easy it is basically to conduct this as a foreign policy. Both sides.
Yeah,
I'm not so sure that I would have agreed at any point that a pandemic would be the easiest place to bring about cooperation. You know, for 200 years, the major countries have been trying to forge agreements on the control of pandemics, precisely because it's so tempting, even though you know it won't work, to take national measures. And if I think about what was going on a few years ago when we might have had this thought, if you look at the reactions to Ebola, for example, which were extraordinary. I mean, I was in California when one case of Ebola arrived, and at one point they shut down part of the school system. Mm-hmm. And I remember hearing an infectious disease expert heroically explaining to the public on national radio that their chances of getting Ebola were lower than their chances of getting to marry Kim Kardashian, you know, and it was a sort of public communication.
I'm not sure which would be worse, though.
No,
but so I don't think pandemics are easy.
That's it. No,
let
that's
me
a good point.
ask
Yeah,
you.
go ahead. Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead. No, please.
You know, the last time there was a sweeping pandemic that affected more than 100 million was the Spanish flu. Every other pandemic is localized and small, though we use the word pandemic because it goes beyond one region. You know, Ebola is primarily in Africa, you know, and MERS was Middle East, went a bit to South Korea. So I don't think we, in our living memory, understand what it is to have a pandemic. But this pandemic, you know, COVID, has really impacted on our lives. We can't travel, we can't go to work. It's changed our lives. And for the first time, this is so. But why is it governments cannot come together? You know, really is sad. And I can only explain it by the politics, the international politics. COVAX has been started in Switzerland, you know, asking governments to contribute vaccines to a common facility to be shared with developing countries. Yeah, it's okay, and United States, I think, said it was going to contribute to COVAX, but it's not like it's raring off, you know. Mm-hmm. So something is happening here.
Yeah. I have a question from Federico Merke, who's, I know, based in Argentina. And it actually goes back to something you were saying about Asia versus the West and different ways of thinking. He has a question about the characteristics of the political system. affect the relationship between scientific expertise and politics, looking at Asia and Europe? As you said, Asia may previously have looked to the United States and Europe as the sources of much scientific discovery in the modern world, and societies or polities that were sort of rationally based and so forth. But is this in fact perhaps, as Ivan would point out in his work, actually Europe and the United States are hotbeds of conspiratorial thinking, of skepticism about science and institutions, whereas Asia seemed to just get with the program on the science. Many Asian countries, Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, South Korea, and said, okay, if the science tells us this, then we will do this. So is it a myth to think that the West is so scientific? We seem like sort of the mythical, irrational, tribalistic West next to a rationalistic, scientific Asia. Is that probably an overstatement, I know, but is that something we should be taking away here?
Well, I think Asia is materialistic, is rational, is pragmatic. We always thought the British were pragmatic. I think it's still pragmatic up to a point, but I think in Western thinking, maybe you are not as materialistic because there's that spiritual, religious element in Western culture. It's becoming more clear to me now. I always thought you were very materialistic, but Chinese culture is very materialistic, and I don't know about Japanese, but I think Korea is quite close to it too. So anthropologists used to mark the difference between the subliminal culture and the materialistic culture. Hindus, Muslims is subliminal. Chinese, Confucianists, the Taoists, we are all materialistic, and we adapt to development much more easily.
But don't we see some correlations in respect of conspiracy theories surrounding vaccinations and COVID between countries that are controlling social media platforms and those which are not? I would have thought that that's actually quite important. So if you look at the Philippines and the role that Facebook's playing in the Philippines in literally just peddling, some pretty bad stuff. It doesn't strike me that this is about Asian or not Asian. It strikes me as it's also about how is it that the society communicates with each other, and how are those communications being channeled, amplified, concentrated, and segregated?
Can I also make a point? Because for me, this is also quite important. Of course, probably there are cultural differences and they matter, but there is also a difference about the composition of the elites. For example, there was this basically comparison saying that a huge number, for example, of the Chinese elite has an engineering education. While a lot of the American political class have been lawyers. So from this point of view, this kind of the nature of the education and basically where you come from and what you're doing also probably has a result. And particularly for the West, in my view, the major question is that to what extent some of the best part of our tradition as a democratic societies is also not becoming now part of our vulnerability. For example, critical thinking, because what we're calling conspiracy theory started with something that was very important for our cultures. Democracies are also about mistrust. Mistrust could be very constructive. I have been living in a system in which people trusted governments too much and it didn't work well. So from this point of view, obviously we're talking about a different balance, about trust and mistrust. And from this point of view, it's interesting to see that the composition, the nature of the political elite, basically the nature of the social media, I very much agree with what Nairi said. It's so important to see that basically the freedom of media in many of our countries is also the freedom basically to get an information that has nothing to do with reality.
It's fake information. Yeah.
But does this imply, Nairi, it's really a good point, Nairi, that you make, but does this imply that the pandemic is also bringing to a sharper edge the real kind of chaotic, unregulated way which we were treating technology in the West, kind of just letting it go and seeing where it takes us, is going to be rethought as a result of the pandemic? Is there a feeling that, wow, if you release a pandemic into an environment, a totally unregulated environment of social media, you're going to get a lot of crazy thinking out there, and you're not going to get the vaccine take-up that you'd like. And so I'm also thinking about, I mean, obviously the pandemic has had a tremendous speeding up of various technological features. Here we are having this meeting online. We wouldn't have been doing this 2 or 3 years ago. And many other ways in which technology has entered our life as a result of the pandemic in new ways. But is it also going to make us question the approach we were taking to technology and think that, wow, remember those days when we thought you could just run a society this way? The pandemic came along and said, wow, if you want a coherent response, you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to have to regulate things more. Is that what you're pointing towards?
I think the pandemic has just slightly accelerated those trends. I think those concerns and worries were all over the place as it is. The worry that children who are raised spending 8 hours on a mobile telephone have worse mental health, less resilience, higher self-harm, higher suicide rates. The idea that societies which segment and fragment into communities where people are fed only information with which we know they will agree and never presented with a different point of view, or they are presented with a different point of view, but have their communication channels are so identity-led that they're not willing to open up to that different point of view, which is on all sides of the political spectrum. I think those were already trends, and they're really dangerous to democracies, because the point of a democracy is that it depends upon the consent of the governed. And if you mess with that consent of the governed, you mess with the possibilities of democracy. And that's something certainly that Russia's troll farms have readily understood and readily sought to manipulate. It's something that the Western Alliance understood at the end of the Second World War. Look at the efforts that went into Voice of America on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and propaganda efforts to try to win the hearts and minds of people. This is not a new problem, but it's one that that technology accelerates and that needs a solution by governments working cooperatively.
Ivan, I don't want to pass up the chance to ask you about Russia. I think I enjoy no one's observations about Russia as much as I do Ivan's. You're a very thoughtful observer of the Russian scene. President Putin has had to face this pandemic, something that wasn't something he didn't expect. And as it hit, I remember I had the same dualism that I thought about populism in terms of how it would affect Putin. I thought early on the pandemic, this could be quite damaging to Putin because it's out of his control. Russia's going to have to show some governance competence. It's not a very well-governed country in real terms. It's got a lot of mythical governance. But then I also thought, wait a minute, somehow Putin's way of saying the world is in crisis, the West is a bunch of hypocrites, this will just allow him to speed up this narrative and say, see, I told you they're hypocrites. Look, they claim to be for everyone. Look at them grasping around at their, the vaccines, keeping them for themselves. And so on balance, has he had a good pandemic or a bad pandemic? Sorry to put that in those terms.
Listen, it's too early to say, because in a certain way, first of all, if you see the level of excessive death, Russia had a bad pandemic.
Yeah, no question about that.
And this is quite important, because this one statistics that it's most
But
difficult.
it's trying to lie its way through that.
Yeah, okay. But people, secondly, if you see the level of mistrust to government, basically Russia has the vaccine, but like some American states, it does not have people who wanted to be vaccinated. Also, this was a crisis in which President Putin did not play his major role as a kind of a leader who solved crisis. Honestly speaking, it was the mayor of Moscow, Mr. Sobyanin, who was the first one who basically say, listen, we should do something and we should lock down and we should do this and that. President Putin was very much locked down himself more than anybody else, and there was a problem of communication. At the same time, Russians did two things, in my view. One, which was very much is what we see as a positive effect for Russia. But the second, which I see highly problematic in the long term. Positively, for Russia, it was extremely important to show that they are science power. And from this point of view, they betted on their vaccine, that they have a good vaccine. They basically declared it before even the trials have been over. And to be honest, it was a risky bet. And for the moment, it worked. Obviously, the Sputnik 5 is not a bad vaccine, and this is quite important, because I do believe the Russians were seeing this very much as a competition between great powers and not simply as a kind of a cooperative story. And they put a lot of effort on this. And we can also see the other part of the story, that at the same time, as a result of this crisis, the level of repressiveness of the Russian regime increased incredibly. Listen, what you see with Navalny, what you see how people have been treated on the streets, even 5 years ago, this was never going to happen in Russia. This was a different social contract. And the reason is that President Putin basically is not doing so badly economically, but the Russian society is losing the dynamism, which is very important for the post-COVID world. From this point of view, Russia is not China. I am not going to see Russia as the big winner out of this. On geopolitical terms, and also because of the confrontation with the United States, Russia was pushed much closer to China than ever before. And I do believe this is a kind of a new reality. And talking not about cooperation, but about competition, one of the things that really worries me in this new geopolitical reality is that you see a much more coordinated foreign policy between Russia and China than ever before. If you see basically what is happening on the Ukrainian border and what is happening on the Taiwanese border, I hope that I'm wrong, but my feeling is that both sides knew early on what the others are going to do and at what part of the day. So in a short term, I do believe that the President Putin basically survived this crisis, but this is not a crisis that made his regime stronger or Russia stronger.
We're going to need to finish in just another minute or two, because we're close to the end of our time. So I want to give each of you, if you have any final thought. Nairi, you have left us with a bit of optimism, which we appreciate, but it's well-founded. You're always a serious thinker about it. And you've emphasized the idea that the trends were there before. The pandemic has intensified and sped them up in a sense, but hasn't really fundamentally changed our world. Is that, you think, an accurate sort of summary of your view overall?
I everything except the last bit, Tom. I think to say that doesn't fundamentally change our world is to ignore that actually, you know, in a fragile equilibrium, if you accelerate one force,
you do fundamentally change. Yes.
I think so. So I think it's time, and I think, you know, my thought would be that the mindsets of observers and commentators like the four of us, of academics and advisors to governments, that we have to transform our mindsets, because the tools that we have had and the tools that we've advised governments to use for the last 30 years need a radical revamp. Every crisis, we've encouraged governments, or we've watched governments pull out what I would call the austerity playbook. That can't work now. Governments actually have to seize an investment playbook. China's done that. Other governments are going to have to learn. For me, what the crisis shows is how important it is that governments learn much, much more quickly from what other countries are doing. That we've got to learn to stop saying, if we're in Britain, oh, we'll only look at the United States. We should have been watching China and learning from China from day one in dealing with this crisis. And likewise, watching and learning from Vietnam, from Senegal, from all kinds of countries. And for me, that's the big takeaway. And obviously, sitting in a government that's trying to do that, that's an important takeaway for me.
I think thank you. That's actually a good way to end. I think Ambassador Chan and Yvonne, we may need to end there because we're short of time. Ambassador Chan, do you have just 10 or 20 seconds worth of something you want to offer us? I don't want to cut you short.
Actually, I was torn between answering David Abramson's question in the chat, but it's very long. Or to sum up this discussion, I think what we did not talk about, but which I think is emerging, is this, that the pandemic has brought back the state, the role of the state, and emphasized the state. Maybe this is a perspective from Asia, but I believe in the West, the state is important. The role of the government is important. And so many such big stimuluses have been thrown around that I worry that we are now entering into a new period where people feel entitled, and there should be these supports given much more. The expectations are high. The one thing which is interesting for me is that we had our elections in the middle of the pandemic. Whilst the government did well, it didn't really help it. The other issues were still there. So gratitude in politics is not what you look for, or you can't expect it. But I think the people are expecting more and more from the state. If you do something, you can still do more. I think that's what's happening. And people are expecting higher standards of healthcare from government.
Among other things.
I have just one sentence, because I do believe competence is important, but also what I learned from this crisis is it's very important how fast you are. The speed of the decision
how fast you are,
changing amazingly. And from this point also the appetite for risk taking. And this is the thing that, for example, worry me slightly about the European Union. All these risk averse cultures, which otherwise were functioning very well in the normal times, basically reluctance to take risk can have a very high price in the moment of crisis.
Nairi, Yvonne, Ambassador Chan, you've helped me advance my thinking. I feel like we've gotten somewhere. I feel farther down the road of coming to terms with these political effects, which are really deep and complex, and we'll be puzzling over this for months and years to come. But thank you so much for joining us for this panel. I really enjoyed the conversation. I know our viewers did as well. So, and thanks to everybody who tuned in. Appreciate your taking part. And thanks to the Robert Bosch Stiftung for a wonderful partnership. It's a great organization which does such good things in the world. And this forum that they've put together in collaboration with Carnegie was just a small sample of their kind of very broad view of international affairs. So Sandra Breca, thank you for that. And we'll see you all again at another event in the future. Bye for now.